Hello, I am back with my next video on morphology. Let's begin. First, we will talk about filler words. Filler words are pauses in speech, but they're also considered morphemes, which is what most of this video is about. Filler words. Well, filler words can occur in between words. Okay, so for example, we have, well, the princess chased her cat. Okay, so filler words could easily be placed in between words. However, filler words can also occur between morphemes. Okay, and when we're talking about morphemes, I haven't really defined it yet much, but I'll give a quick explanation with this example. We have the word princess, which consists of two morphemes. The first morpheme is prince, which is a free lexical morpheme, and then s, which is a bound derivational morpheme. Okay, and when we place a filler word in between two morphemes, we have to repeat the first morpheme before we continue with the rest of the word. So for example, the princess chased her cat. Okay, so notice how I stop at prince, I put my filler word, but when I continue the word princess, I have to repeat the first morpheme prince before I continue on with s. So therefore I could not say the princess chased her cat. It's more natural to repeat the first lexical, free lexical morpheme. The princess chased her cat. Now, let's look at this example. Filler words cannot be used within one single morpheme. So cat, for example, is one free lexical morpheme. And you cannot put a filler word in between that one morpheme. So pretty much you can't split one morpheme. So I can't say mat. No. I would have to say cat. Okay, so I would have to repeat the whole word. I cannot just put a filler word in between one single morpheme and split it like that. All right, let's talk a little bit about words. We have simple words, which are minimal free forms. Okay, and also known as free lexical morphemes, as I mentioned before. Some examples are house, cat, eat, prince, and happy. Okay, you can't shorten those into you can't divide those into two morphemes. They're just single morphemes, so therefore they're minimal free forms. But then we have complex words which may consist of numerous morphemes. We have, for example, farmer, princess, eats, and happier. All four of those words each have two morphemes. So farm is a free lexical morpheme, and would be a bound derivational morpheme. Okay, and then princess has two. Prince is a free lexical morpheme, but s is also a derivational morpheme. Then you have eats. Eat is a free lexical morpheme, and then the s is its own morpheme, the s at the end, which is a bound grammatical inflectional morpheme, okay, which signifies the third person singular. Happier, happy is one free lexical morpheme, and then the at the end would be another derivational morpheme, which expresses comparative. So for example, I'm happier than you. So the does have meaning. Morpheme what? I know you guys are all probably asking yourself, what is a morpheme? Well, to define it, it's the smallest meaningful unit of a word. So for example, the is a morpheme because it is meaningful, and you can't shorten to anything smaller than that. So therefore, would be a morpheme. The s at the end is a morpheme because it has meaning. What is the meaning? Third person singular of the present tense, and you can't shorten it to be any smaller than s. right? Okay, so there's your explanation of that. And then farm is a morpheme because you can't shorten it. You can't make it any smaller without it losing its meaning. Farm is the smallest it could go. You can't put fa and it's going to mean something different. No. Fa does not have its own meaning. Farm does. Okay. Well, we have these morphemes, but then there are variations of morphemes depending on their conditioning. So, and we call these allomorphs. So, one morpheme, as I mentioned before, is a third-person singular morpheme, which is the S. Okay? But the S takes on phonological conditioning. So the sounds change, the S sound changes depending on its location within a word. So for example, we have, these are the allomorphs. We have Z, S, and Uz. Okay? So this S, or ES, for the third person singular, can change its sound depending on the word it's attached to, the word it's bound to. And these are considered grammatical bound inflectional morphemes. So in the word hammers, it takes on the allomorph Z, hammers. So this S makes a Z sound. Then we have the word cuts. He cuts. He cuts the bread. This S takes on a sound of S. And then we have uz, and as in the word buzzes. Okay, and buzzes, the S takes on the uz sound, or the ES. And I will explain in more depth when we get to morphological rules. Here is another morpheme, and it's allomorphs. So we have the past tense morpheme, which is ed, or is written as ed in English. But they take on different phonological variations. So we have t, d, and ud. Notice in all these words I give in the examples end in ed, ed, ed. However, they're all pronounced differently. So talked takes on the t. The ed takes on the t sound, talked. Crawled takes on the d sound, crawled. You can't say crawled. And then pitted. Pitted takes on the ud sound. And also the t changes to a flap, but that's you could watch my morphology video if you want more information on the flap. So voila. These are all the allomorphs for the past tense morpheme in English. Now, in morphology, you might have heard me say free morphemes and bound morphemes. So we distinguish between the two. So a free morpheme is a simple word, a single morpheme, and has potential for independent occurrence. So for example, man. It's a simple word. It's a single morpheme because you can't shorten man into anything smaller and therefore have it and still be meaningful, have meaning, and it could occur independently. Man. There you go. So that is a free morpheme. But then you have bound morphemes, which require another morpheme, such as a free morpheme, to make a word. And it cannot occur independently. So for example, a bound morpheme might be the s. Okay? In the third person singular morpheme, s, cannot occur independently. If I say s, you don't know what I'm talking about. But if I say eats, then you know that the meaning of the s, which means third person singular in the present tense. So therefore, the s requires another morpheme, such as eat, to make a word. So that is a bound morpheme. Some morphemes, though, this is interesting, can have both free and bound allomorphs. Okay, for example, a free allomorph, the free allomorph would be not, but the bound allomorph would be nt. So now it could take on both. So for example, it has the same meaning, but yet one is free and one is bound. So he cannot go to school, or he can't go to school. In the cannot, it's a free allomorph, and in can't, it's a bound allomorph. But it's the same morpheme. All right, and now we have lexical morphemes. So not only do we distinguish between free and bound morphemes, but we distinguish between lexical and grammatical morphemes. So I'm going to start with lexical morphemes, and they convey the content of a message. Okay, so they specify the things, the qualities, the events that are being spoken about. So for example, big is a lexical morpheme because it describes the quality of what is being talked about. And it conveys a message. Okay, and when I say big, that conveys a message to you. Or run. Okay, it's describing the event, what's happening. Or girl. It's specifying the thing. So they all have messages that come along with them in the lexical morphemes. And then you have bound lexical roots. And maybe they're not so common in English, but I found some examples of Nyul, which is actually an extinct language that no longer exists. It became extinct in 1999, and it was a language of Western Australia. And they have 50 bound roots in terms of body parts. But they must take a prefix indicating owner of the body part. So, for example, ngamal means my hand, and you can't have mal without nga. Then you have ni mal, which means your hand, and you can't have mal unless you have ni. Then you have ir mal, which means their hand, and you can't have mal without ir. So these are all bound lexical roots. Derivational affixes. Okay, so derivational affixes or morphemes, they attach to lexical roots because they're bound and result in a new word. And a lot of times you add to a lexical root to give a stem with a related meaning. So these are added to lexical roots or lexical morphemes, but it does not change the meaning. It still has it changes the meaning to a certain extent, but it does not, it still relates to the meaning of the lexical morpheme, the free lexical morpheme. So often it changes the part of speech. So that's a good way to think about it. So for example, the like farmer, okay, farm is a place, but when you add what it does is it's saying the person who works on a farm. Or ish. Okay, it makes the word an adjective. So, for example, child is a noun. That's one free lexical morpheme, but you add this bound derivational morpheme ish, and then it changes child to childish. So it changes it to an adjective. Okay, and full and lee is often used to change the part of speech into an adverb. So quick would be an adjective, and it's a free lexical morpheme. And then you add lee, and it changes the part of speech. You add that good old bound derivational morpheme. All right, now let's talk a little bit about derivational affixes. So we already said that there's relevance to the meaning of the root, and it has concrete meaning. So s means female, so it actually has its own meaning to a certain extent. It can't be used alone. I can't say s and I mean female, but because it's a bound morpheme. So, but if I attach it to something, you could predict the meaning. So if I say, for example, prince, that if I say princess, the S is making the prince feminine, a female. Or a lion and a lioness, right? Also, replaceability, so replaced by a single simple word. So, for example, pretty much what I just said, instead of saying a lioness, I could say a female lion. So there I'm replacing with a single simple word. Regularity, so the meanings are regular and predictable. So, for example, if we want to use S again, I could predict that if I add S at the end of free lexical morpheme, that it's going to make it feminine or female. Or I gave another example here to get away from the S example. We have I's such as publicize, romanticize, vaporize. So it pretty much means what? To make, right? To make public, to make romantic, to make vapor. Okay? And productivity, limited applicability. So the S, even though, it means female, we could say lioness, goddess, princess, but we cannot say elephantess or maness. So in some applications, it's limited. Oh, here we go. Now we got the grammatical morphemes, okay? So we're contrasting the lexical morphemes now with the grammatical morphemes. So grammatical morphemes give information, obviously, about the grammatical structure of a morpheme. So they concern the function of lexical items. So the function of lexical items. Free grammatical morphemes. Okay, so here are some examples of free grammatical morphemes: and, but, by, in, on, not, the, a, that, it, me, etc. So these are all free grammatical morphemes. And there are also, to note, that they're the most frequent words in English. But has is a morpheme with lexical and grammatical usages. So this is interesting in that you could have the same word, but it's used differently. For example, in the word he has a dog, that takes on a lexical use because it conveys it conveys meaning, which is showing possession. Okay, but in the second example, he has stolen the dog, it takes on a grammatical use because now it's an auxiliary verb for a past tense. So it doesn't have meaning in of itself, but it's assisting stolen, and it's playing the role of grammar in making it past tense. So that's a good example of how we could sort of distinguish those two. And then bound grammatical morphemes. Okay, so we have the free, which could stand alone, but now we have bound grammatical morphemes, which means that they need to attach to something. So a lot of times they're inflectional affixes, prefixes, infixes. If we want to, in Tagalog, I know they have a lot of infixes, grammatical bound morphemes are infixes. And then also we have suffixes. Give grammatical info relevant to the interpretation of the sentence. Okay, so yet again it has to do with grammar and how we interpret the sentence. So if I were to add the ed at the end of walked, it becomes walked. It's making us interpret it in a different way, walk, because now we know we're talking about the past because it's in the past tense. And it gives different forms to a single lexical morpheme. So pretty much it's saying that it has to attach onto a lexical morpheme. Because bound morphemes cannot stand alone, right? We can't just say s and have it stand alone. But if we say walks, then thus is taken on meaning. Clitics. Bound grammatical morphemes that grammatically behave as separate words, but are phonologically parts of the preceding or following word. Okay, so if it precedes the word, it's called an enclitic, and if it follows the word, it's called a proclitic. Okay, so for example, he is change to his, or let's see, the apostrophe s to show possession. Okay, so these are bound grammatical morphemes because they show possession, so they're grammatical, and they're bound. They have to. You can't keep the apostrophe s separate. Okay, so the dog's bone, right? Freedom of position and movement in a sentence. I'm not too sure if this is true for English. I couldn't think of any examples for us, but I'm sure that it exists in other languages. Remember, not just talking about English here. Selectivity, so they could attach to lexical items. So, for example, the apostrophe s for possession. Allomorphic variation. Okay, so that they have different variations of the morpheme. And predictability of meaning regardless of word they're attached to. So if we have an apostrophe s, for example, we know that it's going to show possession. And then also the prosodic integration. Now this is sort of interesting. For example, let's stick with the example of the apostrophe s and say the dog's bone. You can't put stress or use intonation with these clitics. So you can't say the dog's bone to stress that the possession. You could say the bone of the dog. That would be another way to construct that sentence and show stress. The bone of the dog, but you can say the dog's bone. Or you could say the dog's bone, have stress on the dog, but you can never have stress on the clitic. So that's how it has prosodic integration. Here I provided a chart just to sort of help you visualize a little bit what we're talking about. So I mentioned how we contrast between free and bound morphemes and also lexical and grammatical morphemes. So you could have a lexical free morpheme, you could have a lexical free bound morpheme, you could have a lexical free or bound lexical root, you could have a lexical free derivational or a lexical bound derivational morpheme. You could have a grammatical free morpheme. You have a grammatical bound clitic or a grammatical bound inflectional morpheme. So these are all the different types of morphemes we could have. And we've talked about all of them thus far. Phonological allomorphs. So I'm just going back to the previous example that I showed with the little chart and the different allomorphs, for example, of the third person singular, how the morpheme changes sound. So it has phonological significance and variation. So s, z, and is. I also want to just mention a little bit the suppletive allomorphs. So these are common. Also, it's showing that they're irregular, pretty much. So, for example, good, you can't say gooder. So you can't add the morpheme or the est morpheme to good. You have to use the suppletive allomorph. So so from good we come to bet as the morpheme, and then we would have to add the inflectional morpheme to show comparison. And then good would also change to be before we added the est inflectional morpheme to show superlative. So voila, those are known as suppletive allomorphs, where the words change. Okay, conditioning factors. So we already talked about phonological conditioning. Allomorphs are selected according to phonological environments. So depending where these morphemes occur within a sentence, they might have some phonological conditioning or variance. So for example, a versus an. Use a dog, but an apple. Okay, and it all has to do with its environment within the sentence. So a, the word that follows will begin with a consonant, and the word that follows will begin with a vowel. So that's A is a morpheme, but it has a variant, an allomorph, which would be an. And then also the s and is again, just labeling as another example that we've talked about. It should be quite familiar by now. And then we have lexical conditioning. So the allomorph depends on the word that the morpheme is attached to. So un and ud have the same meaning, which would be a participle, but it depends on the it depends on the word, the lexical morpheme, to decipher which inflectional morpheme we're going to add to it, whether the n or the ud. So, for example, we have given, eaten, broken versus given, grabbed, wanted. We can't say givid, eated, or broked, and we can say and we can't say grabbin or wannin. Okay, so the n and the ed depend on the word that it's attached to. I hope that was clear. And then morphological conditioning, back to suppletive allomorphs, where good becomes better and best rather than gooder and goodest. So the grammatical morphemes that condition the presence of an allomorph. And then I'm going to end the video with a morphological rule. So we have the past tense morpheme ed, and we develop rules. So why we said we were talking about phonological conditioning. So I'm going to give an example here of how the allomorphs, or how the morpheme conditions, and how each allomorph is used, and in what environment each allomorph is used. So if we have ed, we would insert an in the environment if it's followed a alveolar stop. Okay, so in the example padded, t is an alveolar stop, so we would insert the before d. So padded, padded, right? Padded. Because we have the alveolar stop before that inflectional morpheme. The d of the past tense morpheme will yield a t sound in the environment where if it occurs after a voiceless segment. So in the example stopped, p is a voiceless segment. How do we know it's voiceless? Well, if you take your fingers and put it onto your vocal cords and say p, 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 you'll notice that your vocal cords do not vibrate, therefore it's voiced. The same bilabial stop, so that's a voiceless bilabial stop, is the p. The voiced bilabial stop, b, it's voiced because your vocal cords do vibrate. So if you want to contrast them, you could put your fingers over your vocal cords, say p, 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 and then say b, b, b. And you'll notice that they have the same place and manner of articulation, just the only thing that's different is one is voiceless and one is voiced. So we use the t when this inflectional morpheme occurs after a voiceless segment, such as a p. If it was a b, we wouldn't. As such as in the next example, because the d stays d, so it yields the same sound in the environment otherwise. So if the morpheme does not follow an alveolar stop or a voiceless segment, then that means d is going to stay the same, such as grabbed. Okay, because the b is no longer voiceless, and it is not an alveolar stop, it's a bilabial stop, so therefore you're just going to have grabbed. So we have patted, stopped, and grabbed. And there we see our three allomorphs, which concludes our video. So you have seen a morphological rule, how a morpheme changes and applies its different allomorphs depending on its phonological conditioning. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned something, And I think my next video shall be on lexicon, so I hope to see you there. Thanks a lot. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.